So today's daf in Masechet Chullin on Sunday is daf Ayin Gimel, and we are up to the two dots. The first two dots, 7 lines from the top of the page, and it's a complicated sugya, but it's actually not so many factors. So the underlying issue. Good morning, Nava. The underlying issue here is that we have in our parak. This is the fourth parak of Chullin Behema Mekasher Leilid, an interesting halacha that if a uber, a fetus inside of a mother, sticks out its limb, then that limb is almost essentially a treifa. It was stuck out of the body of the mother, and so it went out into the field. We had a machloket earlier. What happens if it pulls itself back in? Does it untreifa or not? But when it's outside, it's considered to be essentially basar basadeh, meat that's out in the field. We had a machloket yesterday in the Mishnah as to what happens if you then shech the mother, right? So this limb is outside of the mother, then you shech the mother. So there's a halacha that we've talked about many times that if you shech the mother, the uber inside the mother, so the mother cow, if there's a fetus inside of it, whether the fetus is alive or dead, that fetus is mutar to eat, right? Because it doesn't need shchita if it's alive. Well, we'll see actually some details, but let's just say it doesn't. And the reason is because it's part of the mother. What about the limb, right? Does the limb become that's not edible? You cannot eat this limb that was outside of the mother, but does it become a treifa that was shechted, which is not tamei midoraita, or does it become a nevela? It's a dead piece, and the shechita of the mother does not help to take away the status of tuma or of psul from this limb, and therefore it's a nevela, and according to Rabbi Meir, it's mitamei. So we're going to discuss that all today. So that's what the background. Let's just start though with the first part where the Chachamim said this limb that's outside of the mother, when you then shech the mother, the limb itself becomes a treifa that was shechted, right? And they said it's tamei kimaga treifa. Chachamim omrim maga treifa shchuta. It's as if you touched a treifa shchuta, which implies that there's such a thing as tuma on touching a treifa, but that's not true. Ask the Gemara, treifa shchuta mi metamya? There's no tuma. So what do you mean it's like you touched a treifa shchuta? It's like you touched nothing. Treifa shchuta mi metamya. Does the treifa that shechted cause tuma? In fact, it does cause tuma midirabanan. Getavu d'shmo. Damar v'odishmo, Zavu d'shmo said, treifa sheshachda mitama b'muktashim. That although the Torah is very clear that a treifa that you shech, it's not so clear. We learned yesterday a little bit clear that a treifa that you shech is not tamei in terms of touching it for chulin, right, and feeding it to your animal or your slave or whatever, or not your slave, but you're selling it. But it is tamei in regards to hektish in terms of karbanot, and you can't let it mix with karbanot. Okay. Anyway, so that's a small detail. But then back to the Mishnah. So now the question in the Mishnah was, right, why in the world does, again, the limb is outside of the animal, you shech the mother, this limb is not mutar to eat. Everybody agrees with that. We'll see why in some detail. But does the limb become a treifa that was shechted? So the shechita helps to make it a treifa, basically, that's shechted? Or do you say the shechita has no impact on this limb, it's a dead limb, it's considered to be a nevela? Said the Mishnah, now we're quoting the Mishnah, we are around, I don't know how many lines down from the top, but the second two dots, 10 lines from the dot, will say, Ma matzinu b'treifa tahora sheshchitata mitarata. Sorry. Said the Chachamim, just like a regular treifa, you have an animal that's wounded, that's lungs are collapsed, right, or holes in them. And so you shech that animal, you can't eat it because it's a treifa, but it's not tamei because you had shchita. So shchita makes it tahor from being a nevela. Av shchitat behima tzataher ubar. So too the shechting of the mother is mitaher the ubar, meaning the part of the ubar that is outside of the womb that is not edible. Tanya. Now continues the Braita. Amar lahem Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir said to the Chachamim, "What are you talking about? Right? In what case, you guys, the Chachamim, this limb of the animal is outside of the animal and it's usher to eat, right? If the animal dies, the limb becomes a nevela. You're saying that now that you shechted the mother, the limb becomes a treifa and it's therefore not tamei, right? Said Rabbi Meir to Chachamim, I don't get it. What was mitaher the aver zemidei nevela? What caused that to happen? Shchitat imo. You're saying that the shchita of the mother encompasses the tara of this aver. But in Kain Tatir Ba'achila, why don't you say then that you can even eat it? Right? If the shechita of the mother has an effect on even an aver that's outside the body, the same way the shechita of the mother allows you to eat the womb, the uber that's inside the mother, If it includes what's outside the mother to make it not tameh, it should include it for everything. Then you should be allowed to eat this thing even though it's outside the mother. So that was the question Rabbi Meir said to the Chachamim. Amru lo, so the Chachamim said back to him, it's not true. Harbei matzelet al she'eno gufa yuter gufa. In fact, a shechita of a mother can do more for something that's not part of its body than for something that is part of its body. What does that mean? Because we learned that if you're chotech min ha'ubar shebeme'ah mutar b'achila. Remember that if you cut an uber inside of a mother and leave it inside the womb, and then you shech the mother, even though it's pieces, you can eat all of those pieces because they're all considered parts of the mother. But if you took a cut, remember, if you made a cut in an animal, and you took, this is a Mishnah we had earlier, you took minat chol or minat klayot, if you cut a piece of the spleen or the kidney and left it inside the mother, and then you shechted the animal, asur b'achila. A piece that's floating inside an animal is asur b'achila, but a piece that's floating inside an uber is mutar b'achila, inside a uterus. So you see that it's mutar more for what's not its body than for what is its body. Says the Gemara, what does that mean? I mean, how does that explain why this is not tameh? Mike Amar. Amar Rava says Rava of Amir Kidi, and some to the name of Kidi, which is, some people say it's a name or just anonymous. Chasurim and obviously there are words missing in this Braita, and the response of the Chachamim does not make sense on its surface. We've got to add some context. So we always say Chasurim and there are words missing, meaning usually not necessarily that you should add the words, but you have to understand that these words are included in the discussion. And this is how the Braita should really read, or the first word on the line. Amar lehen Rabbi Meir. Said Rabbi Meir to the Chachamim. Okay, again, we're going through this dialogue. This limb, this foreleg of this fetus is sticking out of the mother. It's totally possible to eat. If the mother dies, if the animal dies, this limb is a nevela. What are you saying has changed the status and made this limb not a nevela and not tameh? You're saying it's shchitat imo, that it's the shchita of the mother that therefore affects not just the fetus inside the mother, but the limb attached to the fetus that's outside the mother. But if that's true, says Rabbi Meir and Cain, if the shchita of the mother affects the limb that's outside, tatirenu b'achila, so it should be just like the fetus inside the mother, and it should be mutter to even eat. When you agree with me, you can't eat it. Amrulos, they said back to Rabbi Meir, wait, every treifa is tochiach, because every single treifa is an animal that's standing here, it's wounded mortally. It's not mutar to eat, right? If it dropped dead, it would be a nevela. You do shchita, and the shchita takes it away from being a nevela and turns it into a treifa shchuta. But it doesn't allow you to eat it. You can't eat a treifa. So every single treifa tochiach, shechitata mitarata midei nevela, shchita of a treifa removes the status of nevela, but eino matira b'achilata, but it doesn't allow you to eat it. So clearly shchita can have a middle effect. It can remove status of nevela, but remain a treifa. So what's your question, Rabbi Meir, that if shchita helps, it should be allow you to eat it? So that was the response of the Chachamim to Rabbi Meir. Amar lahem, so Rabbi Meir said back to them, well, one second. It's true about a treifa, but a treifa, it's one body of an animal. Lo intiarta shchita treifa ota. The shchita of a treifa is mitayar it, meaning the animal itself, davar shehi gufa. It's animal itself. But titahereta aver davar she'eno gufa. How is it going to help to be mitaher the limb that's not a limb of the animal? It's a limb of the fetus in the animal. So again, if you view the fetus as being part of the animal, then the shechita should be mitaher the fetus and this limb. If you're saying it's something separate, then how do you know that shechita of the mother is mitaher, this separate limb that's sticking outside the animal? Amrulo, and that's where the Chachamim responded and said, no, of course shechita can protect something or can purify something or have an impact on something that's not part of the animal. In fact, it's the opposite. Because harbei matzelt al she'ena gufa, yuter migufa. In fact, the mother and the shechita of the mother has a greater impact on that which is not the mother than that which is. Sharishanino, as we learned in the Mishnah, chotech min ha'ubar shebeme'ah mutar b'achila. If you cut off pieces of the ubar and leave it inside the womb, and then you shech the mother, you can eat all those pieces because it's just considered to be pieces of the ubar. But minat chol, minat klayot, if you cut off a piece of the chol and the klayot inside the mother, inside an animal, and then you shech the animal, those breakaway pieces are asur b'achila. So you see that there's something actually harsher about the essential animal than about the derivative of the animal, and therefore your question is not a question. And so Tanya Namihachi, in fact, there's a brayta that speaks out this whole dialogue that we just said, that clarifies the dialogue between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, where Amar Lehen Rabbi Meir, where Rabbi Meir said to the Chachamim, how could you argue? Again, this is all back on the basic principle that you have a limb that's sticking outside of the mother, which is not kosher to eat, right? But you shech the mother, and the Chachamim say the shechita at least affects the limb to make it a treifa that's shechted and it's not tameh. And says Rabbi Meir to them, how could that happen? How? What's the mechanism to mitaher this limb that's sticking outside of the mother from being a nevela? Amrulo, they said, well, the shchitat imo. The fact that the mother was shechted affects the limb. And so Rabbi Meir said back to them, Imkain, if it affects the limb, it should be mutter to eat. You're not consistent. Imkain tatirenu b'achila, you should even be allowed to eat it. Amrulo, so they said back to him, again, the same dialogue, treifa tochiach. A treifa clearly shows you're wrong. Not every time that shchita does something does it make it mutar to eat. Shechitata mitarata midei nevela, because shchita of a treifa animal makes it no longer nevela and therefore not tamei, but inamatirata ba'achila, but it doesn't allow you to eat it. Amar Len, Rabbi Meir said back to them, okay, that's true about a treifa because it's one animal. Im tiara shchita treifa ota. If a treifa, now the next words are gonna throw us on a big tangent for the rest of today's daf, so I'm gonna read them slowly. So it said Rabbi Meir back to them in the Braita, so let's really get this. Let me just find our place. We are the last words on the second of the wider lines on Ayin Bet Amud Aleph, Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph, whatever, Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph. Amar Lahen, Rabbi Meir said back to them, 1 second. Im tiara shchita treifa ota. I get that if you have shchita of a treifa, it will be mitaher that own animal. And also introducing a brand new concept, which is aver hamidul dalba. Now we're going to get back to this in a second, but let me just explain. An aver hamidudal literally means a limb that is hanging from the animal. We're going to have a whole discussion later in the Masechta from a very interesting pasuk that if you have, it's called nipul. Let's say you have limbs or meat or skin that's falling off an animal, meaning it's essentially been severed. And it's still connected to the animal partially, but not connected enough that it can stay alive. Okay, and we'll discuss later the parameters of that. But basically, an animal's walking around and it has a wound, right? So an animal bit it, and there's a chunk of meat and limb that's basically falling off. So that part that's falling off, there's a whole huge discussion as to whether that's considered to be treifa, meaning even if you shecht the animal, can you eat that part or not? Says Rabbi Meir as a throwaway, and again, we're going to get back to this, that I understand that although you probably cannot eat that part of the animal, it's not considered to be a nevela by shchita. So shchita will turn that into a treifa, okay? So I'll read those words again. Mitaharata midei nevela, where am I? Third line. Ve'eta amar lahen im tiara shchita treifa ota. Shchita of a treifa will be matter that animal, and also the aver hamidul dalba, and also a limb that is hanging off that animal, which is essentially a treifa in this version, but it will become mutar and won't become a nevela by doing shchita. But that's davar she'igufa. That's because it's the actual animal, davar she'igufa. But how do you know that will apply to the limb of the fetus? And that's where the Chachamim responded, just like we said previously. Amrulo harbe matzal tal she'ena gufa yoter migufa. That in fact, the shechita of the mother can do more for something that's not the actual mother than something that is the mother. Shari Shanino, as we're going to have in the Mishnah, as we had in the Mishnah, or we quoted it earlier, it's actually a Mishnah later, that if you cut off a piece of the uber inside the mother and then you shech the mother, you can eat those pieces. But minat chol, minat klayot, if you cut off a piece of the spleen or the kidneys and it's freely floating around inside the body, and then you shech the animal, asur b'achila, you're not allowed to eat that extra piece. So that is the Braita. Now, says Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish. Okay, so we have now, I'll just take a step back, again, it's super complicated. We have a machloket between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim about, you have an uber, it sticks out its limb, you shech the mother, does the shechita of the mother change the status of that limb from a nevela to a treifa or not? Okay, that's the machloket. Says Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, 5 lines from the bottom of Ayin Gimel Amud Aleph. I'm Rish Lakish. Ki machloket b'ubarin, kach machloket be'evarim. You want to know something? The machloket that we just talked about, Reb Meir and the Chachamim, by ubar, does the limb of the ubar become tahar or not by the mother's shchita? The same machloket would be true when there's a limb hanging down from the mother. So if you have a limb hanging down that was cut off, right, or not necessarily a mother, right, any animal, and the limb is attached but still hanging, so we're going to see you're not allowed to eat it, and then you shech the animal. According to Rabbi Meir, the shechita does nothing, and that limb is tamei nevela. And according to the Chachamim, the shechita works, and it's a tuma. It's not tamei because it's a treifa that was shechted. Okay, now that doesn't really fit with the brayta we just quoted, but we're going to ask that question in a minute. That's what Reish Lakish said, and Rabbi Yochanan said, no, machloket be'evra du ubar. The only machloket is when you're talking about the limb of a fetus, where Rabbi Meir says it's not tahar, and the Chachamim say it is tahar. Ava be'ever de behima, but if you're talking about the limb of the animal itself, divrei hakol, everybody agrees. We think this means Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. Shchita osen nipul, that when you do shchita, it causes that limb to be fallen off. Nipul means fallen off, and meaning you treat it as if it fell off before the shchita, and therefore the limb is as if it's part off of the animal, and it's either Ever Menachai or it's Nevela. We'll talk about that. But it's tamei regardless. So shchita for sure, and you use these words are going to come back over and over. Shchita osen nipul, which means the act of shchita makes it as if that limb already fell off before you did shchita. So the limb is not permitted from the shchita, right? And the limb itself is nevela, basically. So that is the machloket Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Now, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, said Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina, I don't get it. My time in Rabbi Yochanan, libid Rabbanan. What Rabbi Yochanan is now saying is that when the Rabbanan said in our Mishnah that when you shech the mother, the limb that's outside the mother becomes a treifa shchuta and it's not tamei, is only true about a limb from the fetus. But if it's a limb that's hanging down from the mother, from the animal, the Chachamim say it does not make it a treifa. What's the reason for that? Why is there a difference between the ubar and the limb hanging down from the parent? My time with Rabbi Yochanan, libid Rabbanan, that one is tamei and one is not tamei. The answer is, says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, because hi itle tekanta b'chazara, hi letle tekanta b'chazara. Rabbi Yochanan, if you call earlier, said that when a fetus sticks out a limb, if it pulls it back in, it's no longer a treifa. So because it has the potential to be back as part of the animal itself, when you shech the mother, it encompasses that limb, and that limb becomes tahar and is no longer a nevela. But by the limb that's hanging, which is fatally or irreversibly damaged, there's no takanta b'chazara, and therefore shchita osenipul, and when you do shchita, it's as if that limb fell off already and it's a nevela. Okay, that's the explanation of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Meitzvei. Now ask the Gemara, what about the following brayta, or the brayta we just read a few minutes ago? Because Amar lahem Rabbi Meir said to the Chachamim, what are you talking about? How could you say that a shchita of the mother will be mitaher the limb that's sticking out of the ubar? He said the following words: Lo im tiarta shchita treifa. I get that a shchita of a treifa is mitaher ota, the animal, ve'eta ever hamedudalba, and the limb that's hanging down from it, which is davar shebegufa, which is something that is part of the animal itself. But titaher to ubar davar shebegufa. How could it work on an ubar which is not part of the animal itself? But clearly, Rabbi Meir is saying that shchita is mitaher the aver that's hanging down from it, right? That meaning it's a treifa shchuta and it's not tamei. And we just said, Reish Lakish said that it's a machloket Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim, and Rabbi Meir holds it is not a treifa shchuta. And then Rabbi Yochanan said everybody agrees that it's an nevela. So it says more. Turn the page to Daf Ayin Gimel Mubet. Bishul Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, who said that according to Rabbi Meir, the limb that's hanging is a nevela. At least Rabbi Meir is responding to the Chachamim. He's saying, "L'divreihem kamarlu." According to you, l'didi. Now, according to me, Rabbi Meir says, "Lo shna ever de ubar, lo shna ever de behema ki adadi ninu." I claim that whether the limb is hanging down from the animal, it's an aver, it's a nipul, right, a midjudal, or it's the fetus's limb, neither one of them becomes tahar when you do shchita, right? But according to you, Chachamim, it is, right? So that's what he's saying. L'divrayim de Chachamim kamar. That according to you, a limb that's hanging down, I understand could become a treifa shchuta because it's part of the animal itself. But how does the limb of the ubar, which is not part of the animal? Rabbi Yochanan kasha. According to Rabbi Yochanan, makes no sense because Rabbi Yochanan just told us that even though Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim argue, and the Chachamim say that when you shecht a mother, the limb of the fetus becomes tahor, it's only true by the limb of the fetus, but not by the Eivra Meduldal, not the limb of the mother or the animal itself. And here Rabbi Meir is saying everyone agrees that it's tahor. So Rabbi Yochanan Kasha, Ella, I hope this is clear because it's complicated. Ella, says the Gemara, ki itmar hachi itmar. You got to change the words. Definitely got to change the words here. And so let's start over, basically. Not start over, but let's reread it. We are now 4 lines from the top of Ayin Gimel Amud Bet. This is, in fact, what the machloket Reb Reish Lakish and the Chachamim. And so again, just to go back, the Mishnah's argument between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim was about the limb of an uber that is sticking outside of the mother. Okay, there Rabbi Meir said it is a nevela, and the shechita of the mother does not help. And the Chachamim said the shechita of the mother helps. It affects this limb. It doesn't make it kosher. It's still a treifa, but it's a treifa shchuta. Now the question is, what about a limb of a mother, or not a mother, an animal that is its own limb that's hanging down, that is not going to be kosher to eat, and then you shech the animal itself? Does that limb become a treifa, which is the words mean shchita osenipul, that when you shecht it, the limb is like it fell off and it's not included in the shchita? Or do you say ein shchita osenipul? Shchita does not make it as if it fell off. So now, how do you apply the Mishnah to that? So yitmar hachi yitmar. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, said Reish Lakish ki machloket be'ubarim. The same way there's a machloket between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim by an ubar, whether it's a nevela or not. Kach machloket be'evarim. The same machloket would be true about a limb that's hanging down, that according to Rabbi Meir, the shechita would not help, and according to the Chachamim, the shechita would help. And Rabbi Yochanan says, no. Machloket be'ever de'ubar. They only argued by the limb of the fetus. Aval be'ever de behima, the opposite of what Rabbi Yochanan said before. Divrei hakol, everybody agrees, ein shchita osenipul. Shchita does not make it as if it fell off, and therefore it's still attached, and the shchita is mitaheret from being a nevela. So everybody agrees, says Rabbi Yochanan, even Rabbi Meir, that shchita has an effect on the limb of the animal. The only machloket is a limb of the fetus. And says Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chanina, my time at Rabbi Yochanan, libed Rabbi Meir. Now Rabbi Yochanan is claiming that Rabbi Meir himself makes a distinction between the fetus's limb, which is not tahar, and the mother or the animal's limb, which is tahar. What's the reason for the difference? Obviously, the difference is Hai Gufa, I love Gufa. One is the mother's body, or I keep saying mother, but the animal's body, and the other is not the animal's body, it's the fetus's body. And Rabbi Meir holds that that's a different status. And so therefore, that's why Rabbi Yochanan holds there's a machloket, not a machloket, there's a agreement about a limb that's hanging, but disagreement about an ubar. And according to Reish Lakish, it's the same status. They're both limbs that are falling off. One is the mother's, one is the fetus's, and it's the same machloket. So that's the machloket. Says Rabbi Yochanan, Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef on Rabbi Yochanan, what we just mentioned is shchita, right? So you take an animal, its limb is falling off, you shech the animal. Says Rabbi Yochanan, according to everybody, that limb is not considered to be a nevela, it's considered to be a treifa shchuta. Says Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef and Rabbi Yochanan, that's only true if you shecht it. But akol modim, everybody agrees, shemita osenipul, that if an animal dies, then the limb that was hanging off of that animal is nipul, is as if it fell off before it died. Okay? Now, I'm going to read the next words, and then I'm going to explain this. Ve'ein shchita osenipul. But shchita does not make it nipul, which of course is what we just said, that when you shech the mother, the limb is considered to be part of not the mother, shech the animal, the limb is considered to be part of the animal, and it's not a treifa. It's not a nevela. It is a treifa. It's not a nevela. But what is the first part of what Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan? That everybody agrees that mita is osenipul, meaning if an animal dies and its limbs were hanging off of it, you treat that limb as if it fell off before the animal died, right? Now the question, of course, is why does that matter, right? The animal died, so it's a nevela. So whether the limb fell off before or after, the limb is also a nevela. But if you recall, a limb that falls off when the animal's alive is called aver min hachai, right? So if you say that mita osenipul, that means that when an animal dies, it's as if the limb fell off before it died. So the limb itself is Ever Min Achai. Now, I told you yesterday that Ever Min Achai is Tameh like Nevela. So why would it matter whether this limb is a nevela, meaning it was there when it died, or it was an Aver min achai and it fell off before it died? And the difference is that although Aver min achai is tamei like a nevela, the parameters are different. Because an Aver min achai is only tamei if it's an Aver, if it's a limb, right? And we're going to learn this later. We have a whole parak about this. That Aver min achai has to be meat and flesh and skin. There has to be all the components, Aver, basar, yidim, and somot, and things like that, in order for it to be tamei. But if it's just a piece of meat, for example, just a piece of flesh from the animal, that is not mitamei like Aver min achai, okay? And so, but nevela, of course, is tamei, even a piece of flesh. So there's a big difference between whether this limb that is falling off the animal is considered to have fallen off before it died, in which case it's Aver min achai, and it's tamei for that reason, or whether it fell off after death and it's a nevela, and therefore it's tamei even higher level. And what Rabbi Chanina said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan is that everybody agrees. Sorry, that where am I? That mita aver. I'm sorry, where am I? That mita is osen nipul, and that when an animal dies, it's as if that limb came off before death. So therefore, the limb is tamei for aver min achai. The rest of the animal is tamei for nevela, and we'll see why in a second. Okay. That is what we think it means. Now, ask the Gemara b'mayaskina. Exactly, what are we talking about in terms of the mother and the fetus, right? Meaning, are we talking about a animal, or mother, we'll call it, or are we talking about a fetus? We are, sorry, let me give you the place, around 12 lines from the top, second word on the line. What is Rabbi Yochanan referring to when he just said that death, mita osenipul, but shchita does not make nipul? If he's talking about the limb that's falling off of the ubar, what do you mean everybody agrees? Miflig polik, right? That's the machloket in our Mishnah between Rabbi Meir and the Chachamim. What do you mean everyone agrees? No one, you can't say everyone agrees. Ella, he's clearly talking about the aver de behema, the way I just explained it. Rabbi Yochanan is talking about the limb of the animal itself, which doesn't have to be a mother anymore, just an animal. And what he's saying is that if the animal dies, the limb is as if it fell off before death, so it's Aver min achai. And if the animal is shechted, the limb is as if it didn't fall off, and therefore the shechita will take away the status of tumah from that limb. Says Gemara, that's a great halacha. Thank you, Rabbi Yochanan. But there's a beferish Mishnah, mita tanina and shechita tanina. We have a Mishnah that tells you both of those halachot, both that mita osenipul and that shchita in osenipo. What are the mishnayot? Mita tanina. Let me show you the mishnayot of an animal that dies, that a limb that's hanging down from it is as if it fell off before it died. Because the Mishnah says, it's the Mishnah later in our Masechta, meta habehima, right? Again, the case here is you have an animal that has a limb that's hanging down, and then the animal drops dead. Meta habehima. Says the Mishnah later, habasar tzarich hechsher, the meat that's hanging down from that animal needs hechsher. Hechsher is when, something is not innately tamei, but becomes tamei from something else. You have to first wash it over with liquid in order for it to become tamei. That's what hechsher means, right? It has to be prepared for tumah. So the meat needs hechsher, right? Which is a way of saying that the meat is not tamei on its own. It's only tamei if it was prepared to be tamei and then touched something tamei. But the actual limb is mitamei mishum aver min achai. Right? The limb is mitamei mishum aver min achai, ve'eno mitamei mishum aver min hanevela. It's not considered to be a limb that fell from a nevela. It's considered to be exactly what we just said, that mita usen nipul, that the death means that this limb fell off before it died. So the limb is aver min achai, and remember, like I said, aver min achai, the limb itself is tamei, like a nevela, but the meat is not tamei unless it touches something tamei, and therefore it's tzarech hechsher. So so that's a beferish Mishnah that mita osenipo, that when an animal dies, it's as if the limb fell off and is aver min achai and not nevela. And in fact, shchita nami tanina. The halacha that you said about shchita, that shchita ein osenipo, and that when you shecht an animal, if there's a limb that's hanging down from it, that limb is still considered attached and becomes tahar from nevela, is in fact also in the exact same Mishnah later. Because the Mishnah says, Nishchata behema, if you shecht an animal, huchsheru b'dameh, the meat becomes tamei or susceptible to tumah, because the blood of the animal washed over it, and the blood of the animal is liquid. Divrei Rabbi Meir. right? And Rabbi Shimon says, I disagree, the blood does not make it kosher, but that lo ichshuru. But what you see from here is that the meat is not tamei. Remember, a nevela has innate tuma. It doesn't need to become hukshar to be makabel tuma. It is tamei. So from the fact that the Mishnah is saying that the behema itself, the meat of the animal that's hanging down, needs to have hechsher, tells you it's not a nevela. So you have a beferja Mishnah that the shchita does not make nipul, and the meat that's hanging down is not a nevela, and that mita makes nipul, and the meat that was hanging down is an aver minachai, right? So why does Rabbi Yochanan repeat that? Answers the Gemara, you're right. In fact, Rabbi Yochanan agrees with both of those mishnayot. But imehahi, if we just had the mishnayot later, where am I? Imehahi, we're around 10 or 12 lines from the bottom. Hava amina, I would have made a mistake. And I would have read that Mishnah later and said, when it says huchsharu, that the liquid basically is muchshar lekabel tuma, it's referring to the basar only, right? It's only referring to the meat, not to the limb itself. And basically only the basar is mikabel tuma, right? But the because it's Ever Menachai, right? So meaning I would have thought that even if you do shchita of the mother, not the meat, shchita of the animal, when it says you do shchita of the animal, the meat that's hanging from that animal, the limb that's hanging from that animal, is mikabel tuma if you do hechsher, which is a way of saying it's not a nevela. Maybe it's only referring to the meat. And in fact, shchita does make nipul, and you would view this limb as if it fell off before the animal died. So the limb is Ever Menachai. As we said in the Mishnah, Aver Menachai is only Tamei if you have the Aver, if you have the limb. But if the meat falls off of the Aver Menachai, or you have what's called Basar Menachai, that's not Tamei. So maybe, in fact, Shchita is Osen Nipul, right? And the animal is considered to be detached before Shchita. And when we say Huchsharu, we're only referring to the Basar. Just remember, the word doesn't make any sense. Huchsharu Ketani, Huchsharu is plural. It means it as a limb, it as flesh and bone. Well, you're right, but Ma'atema, I would have thought plural is not referring to the limb and the flesh. It's referring to Chad the Basar Paresh Min HaBehema, V'chad the Basar Paresh Min HaEver. One is referring to when you have a situation where there's meat, the flesh, not a limb, but flesh hanging down from an animal. And one is referring to a place where you have a limb hanging down, but some flesh comes off of that limb. And therefore, I would have thought, if I just read this Mishnah later, that I would have thought, if I just read the Mishnah later, that in fact, when the Mishnah says that if you shecht an animal that has a limb hanging down from that animal, that that the flesh is not tamei, it's not because it's not as if it fell off before it was dyed. Maybe it is as if it fell off before it died, and therefore it's Ever Menachai. But the reason that it's not tamei is because it's only the basar and not the basar and the limb. Okay? And we're telling you two types of basar. A basar that actually is coming off of the limb itself that was hanging down, and basar that's coming off the animal itself. Why would you need to tell me two types? My ome dahai dahai, right? Why would you need to say one type of basar and another type of basar? Well, that's a whole different question. Because sal kedai techamina, I would have thought, ho mitame tuma chamura agav aviv, emeloli by hechsher kamash malan. I would have thought that, the part of a aver min hachai that's hanging down, that then you take off the flesh, that the flesh itself does not need hechsher, meaning water, to wash over it, because since the aver itself is aver min hachai, that's what we call aviv, its father, right? Its parent body. Maybe it doesn't need hechsher, and so there's a chiddush here that the meat that comes off the basar that comes off of an aver min hachai or off of an animal itself definitely needs hechsher. So kamash malan. Now, again, I'm going to pause here and just repeat everything we just said because I know it's super confusing, at least to me. And basically, Rabbi Yochanan is not telling us anything we didn't know from the Mishnah. But if you had read the Mishnah, you would have misunderstood it. But the final halacha of Rabbi Yochanan, which we say is the Mishnah later on in Masechet Chullin, is that, again, you have a situation where you have an animal, it gets a wound, let's say, and its limb is falling off of it. Okay, and in a way, we'll discuss this later, that it's not going to heal. It's never going to come back and become part of the animal. it doesn't make it a treifa, right? The animal can still live without this limb, so it's not in a way that would cause it to be a treifa. But because the limb is basically mostly detached from the animal and it's never going to be reconnected, there's a halacha we're going to have later that if you shech the animal, you can't eat this limb. It's considered to be separate from the animal. The question is, when does that limb become something as if it fell off while the animal was alive, and therefore it's Aver min achai? Or does it become something that didn't fall off when it's alive, and therefore it has the same status as the shechted animal, right? Or the dead animal. If it didn't fall off when it's alive, then it depends what happens to the animal. If the animal dies, then the animal's a nevela, and the limb is a nevela if it didn't fall off while it's alive, right? If it did fall off while it's alive, it's Aver min achai. If you shech the animal, then the question is the limb is not mutar to eat. But if it's still part of the animal when it died, then it's mutar from the shchita, and it's no longer tamei as a nevela, but it will become tamei as an animal, as any meat, if it was muhshar, if it touched liquid, and then was touched by something tamei. So the halacha that Rabbi Yochanan said, which is again our Mishnah later, is that mita osen nipul, that if an animal drops dead, then that, or is killed in some way, then that limb that was hanging down is as if it fell off before it died, and it's Aver min achai, and it's tamei as Aver min achai, but only if it's an Aver. The meat of that is not tamei from Aver min achai, it would have to touch something tamei. And if the animal is shechted, then it's as if the limb was not detached. So shchita eina osen nipul, it's as if it was not detached, and therefore shchita will be mitaher this limb from being a nevela. Okay, so now we've got all the halachot. It's very clear. Hopefully this never comes up in practice, but that is the halacha of Rav Yosef. Let's just finish today's daf by Rav Yochanan, sorry. Says Rav Yosef, 6 lines from the bottom, this is a really good halacha. Am Rav Yosef, Nikot Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef bidach. Remember these words, meaning write this down or keep it in memory. The words are Rav Yosef bar, I keep saying the wrong name, Rav Yitzchak bar Yosef, who quoted Rabbi Yochanan as saying, Shmita osanipol and Ein Shchita osanipol. That is a tried and true statement. You got to keep it in your book. Why? The Rabba bar Bechana koi kavate, because Rabba bar Bechana, who we held in very high regard, said the same thing. So we got two really great independent sources right now. The Tanya, where did Rabba bar Bechana say this? We quote in a Braita. The Braita says the following, and this is the source for this halacha, that a limb that's hanging down is not allowed to be eaten. It says in the pasuk, basar b'sadeh treifa lo tochel. If you have meat in the field, that's a treifa, don't eat it. We learned yesterday we learned something else from this pasuk. But it says this Braita, l'havi ha'ever v'habasar medudalin bebeima b'chayal ba'of. Let's say you have a limb or meat or basar that's hanging down from an animal, a wild animal, a bird, and shachtan. Then you shech the parent, right? Not the parent, the animal. Shehin asurin. That limb or meat that's hanging down is asur to eat. That is based on the pasuk of basar b'sadeh treifa lo tochela. We'll see later how we learn it from that pasuk. And says Rabba bar Bechana Rabbi Yochanan, that is not really true. It's not really true that you can't eat that. It's really only midrabanan. It's an asmachta. Ein bahen ela mitzvat prosh bilvad. It's only a mitzvah midrabanan to separate yourself from this thing. And in fact, which is the halacha, shchita ein osanipul. And because shchita ein osanipul, when you shech the animal or the bird, the limb that's hanging down is still considered to be part of the animal. And so really, midoraita, you can eat it. The Rabbanan said you're not allowed to do it, and we based it on this pasuk. But in fact, midoraita, you're allowed to eat it. And that is how you explain it. I'm going to read 2 more lines, just because it's the end of the sugya. I don't know if you're going to do it again tomorrow. A few more lines. Yativ Rav Yosef kamed Rav Huna. Now there was a story where Rav Yosef was sitting in front of Rav Huna. V'yativ kamar, and he said in the name of Rav Yehuda Marav, he said in the name of Rav Yehuda Marav, Achlo lezel loka. If you eat the flesh, again, the case is the basar's miduldal, the limb or the flesh is hanging down from the animal, you shech the animal, you're not supposed to eat that flesh. Said Rabbi Yehuda Marav, if you eat it, you get makot, which implies it's an Isser Doraita. Amarle Mehur Rabbanan, now one of the Rabbanan, we don't know who, was sitting in the Beit Midrash, said to Rav Yosef, or said about Rav Yosef, don't listen to Rav Yosef. He doesn't know what he's talking about. Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Mirta mishmei Rav. Rav Yitzchak bar Shmuel bar Mirta said in the name of Rav, you don't get makot if you eat it. So said Rav Huna, now what are we going to do? We got one opinion from Rav Yosef that it's makot, and one opinion from this other Tana, or this other Amora, that there's no makot. Amalei Rav Huna, nan nismach. Who do we rely on? Which ruling of Rav? And Rav Yosef turned around and gave him the death look, right? Junior Rav Yosef lap there. Rav Yosef turned around and gave him the stare and said, Amarle, my kushya. Why are you questioning? There's no contradiction. It depends on how the animal died. I was talking about where the animal died, so the limb became nipul, Avram Menachai, to osen nipul, and you get makot. You, when he quoted Rav as saying, you don't get makot, b'shchita, de'ena osen nipul. When you shechted, everybody agrees, and now we have multiple sources for this halacha. Rabbi Yochanan, Rabba bar bar Chana, and this story now of Rav Yosef and Rav Huna, that shchita eno osen nipul. So when you shecht the animal, the limb is as if it's still attached and it's not nevela or Avram Menachai. And mita osen nipul, and the limb becomes Avram Menachai, and therefore you get makot if you eat it. And so that is the thing you can remember. We're going to continue discussing this tomorrow, but we will stop here, 6 lines from the top, and hopefully this is clear enough for everyone. Have a wonderful day. Shavua Tov. It's a tough daf. We got this.
Shavua Tov. Thank you.
Shavua Tov.
Yeah.